Hello, my name is Alejandro Nerivera.
My name is Chiara de Arca Castro.
My name is Ana Mariela Cadenas Villavicencio, and today we're going to be answering the question of:
Is DNA cloning the answer to save endangered species?
But first, to answer this question, we need to go to the basics. What does DNA is? DNA is a molecule made up of two chains that wrap around one another to create the genetic structure or blueprint. It is responsible for providing the information necessary to create the structure and functions of living organisms, such as humans, viruses, and plants.
Now that we know what DNA is, what's cloning? Well, the general term of cloning means obtaining multiple copies of something. It can be either individuals of species, animal, or molecules. This means that DNA cloning allows us to get multiple copies of identical sequence-specific double-stranded DNA fragments, and this is for different purposes.
think of a sheet of paper you want to copy. What do? You put that sheet on the machine, and the machine will pass the information through another sheet. So now you have two identical sheets with exact information. Now that we know more about what DNA cloning and DNA cloning is, let's take a look at the steps used for DNA cloning.
There are obviously different types of methods to clone DNA. You can clone it by using a bacteria. We extract DNA from this and insert it in a vector that can replicate in a host, being in this case a bacteria.
This DNA has to be displayed in a way that the bacteria start cloning it inside of it. But this case isn't useful sometimes because you don't know how many times the bacteria is going to start cloning the DNA.
But let's stop talking about Dolly and let's answer the proposed question. Is DNA cloning the answer to save endangered species? And the answer is maybe. Yes, we know that we can clone animals, but the tricky part is that you need at least 3 specimens from the same kind of animal. And even if you don't use the same method, there is many ethical dilemmas and debates about if this should be legal or if this should be done.
Electric shocks were used to stimulate the cell to get divided. This was resulting an embryo. When the embryo was turned into a ball of cells, it was inserted into the womb's female surrogate. When Dolly was born, it was a clone of a sheep that donated that body cell.
This means that you need 3 different types of specimens from the same kind of animal. As said before, not only Dolly has been cloned by this technique called the nuclear transfer technique. There have been different types of animals such as pigs, frogs, cats, dogs, cows, etc. Another important thing that we have to keep in mind is that Dolly took 276 attempts to be cloned, and it wasn't the first mammal cloned. In 1995, Megan and Morag were 2 sheep cloned from embryonic cells grown in a lab.
Now, for the question that we're trying to answer, there is a different process that has shown positive results many times, being the case of Dolly the sheep, the most famous one. To clone Dolly, scientists took an egg cell from a female sheep and took its nucleus away. Then, they took a body cell from another female sheep, took its nucleus away, and inserted it into the egg cell.
Actually, in 2001, scientists announced the birth of the first endangered species clone, which was a baby. It was a baby wool gower, which is a species of a large wild ox from Southern Asia, who received the name of Noah. Noah sadly died later by an infection, but this was not related with the procedure. But this was a clear example of how we can save endangered species by cloning it. But as we said before, this is nothing clear, and it has a big dilemma with the ethical and the moral decisions.
Well, our conclusion is that as DNA cloning has its advantages, it also has its disadvantages. Being the danger it involves the surrogate and the fetus, some of them. But we prefer to keep like the positive things that it can give us, like saving a complete species or the enormous amount of doors that it can open for research.
Thanks for watching.
Hope you liked your video and did you learn something new about DNA cloning and of the case of Dolly, which was the first animal clone.
Bye!
And now it's time for bloopers. No, bloopers.
Now that we know what DNA is, what's contained? ¿Qué mal estoy diciendo? What's cloning?
Now, for the question that we're trying to answer, there is a different process that has been shown positive results many times, being the case of Dolly the sheep, the most famous one. In order to clone Dolly, scientists took
Have two identical sheets with the exact information. Now that we know,
Now that we know what's DNA, ¿me equivoqué?
Now, for the question that we're trying to answer, there is a different process that has shown positive results many times, being the case of Dolly the sheep, the most famous one. Dolly was the scientist.
actually, in 2001, scientists announced the birth of the first endangered species, which was a baby.
It can be either
But let's stop talking about Dolly, and let's answer the proposed question.
the general term of cloning is obtaining similar. Yeah.
But let's stop talking about Dolly, and let's answer the proposed.
Well, our conclusion is that as DNA cloning has its